Hello, young scholars. This is Mr. Martiron with your Flip Classroom, an introduction to the major world religions. Now, we've talked about in class the idea of a belief system, and this stems from the fundamental human ability to answer big questions. What's the purpose of life? Why are we here? What is in the afterlife? And as people and communities begin to ask these questions, religions begin to develop. And the whole idea of an organized religion is that members of faith or believers of faith migrate into a single community where they share rituals, they share sacred texts, and they share sacred places that allow members of the community to practice their faith in different locations. These faiths, as we know, will become portable and universal, and they migrate around the world. Judaism is the world's first monotheistic religion, and it's a faith that developed among the Hebrew people and was first written down in the first millennium BCE. While it's not the world's largest religion, its ideas were highly influential for later belief systems and would be spread all over the world. Okay, so let's jump back to the first millennium, where traditions and ideas were traditionally handed down orally through word of mouth. Well, the Hebrews come along and they begin to write things down. And they establish two small kingdoms in an area just south of the Mediterranean Sea between the Jordan River known as Khan. And politically, this is unimportant because you have two much larger empires with the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So the Hebrews created a new religious belief, and this was known as a monotheism, where it was based on the idea of a belief in one God. Beginning in the late 600s, Hebrews began to write their traditions and laws and histories and ethics down in a book known as the Torah. Some of you that may be familiar with the Torah know that this will go on to serve as, in Christian religion, this is what becomes the Old Testament. So in looking at Judaism as a community, Judaism has a set of customs, traditions, and beliefs that are associated with Hebrews. And therefore, it's a belief system that's tied both religiously and to an ethnic community. And this community of believers comes together to form a more unified kingdom in the search of the Promised Land. Now, originally, Hebrews were nomadic pastoralists, meaning they followed herds of sheep and goats. And they were organized into tribes, and each tribe consisted of numerous families who thought of themselves related to one another. And they adopted and settled this agricultural community in Khan, and some of them lived in other larger cities. And we know that the Jewish towns and kingdoms were taken over or destroyed by the other larger empires that surrounded them, and Jews become exiled from their lands. So how this relates to our study with networks, as Jews moved from area to area, they brought their faith and culture with them and established new networks. So in fact, by being exiled from their homelands, they established new sets of networks that actually make the fiber of their religion stronger. As we use the production and distribution frame to examine Judaism, we have to understand that certain empires put restrictions on Jews' ability to own property and restrictions on the type of jobs they could do. So Jewish people found themselves in a particular situation where they could only obtain certain professional jobs that were related really to banking and trade, and this would continue on through several centuries. The development of urban life among Jews created more specialized economic opportunities, especially with crafts and trade. People specialized in occupations, as in most ancient societies they did. These were crafts of families and trades, and women worked in fields along with their husbands in rural areas in the shops in the cities. So the core belief of Judaism is that God made a covenant with Abraham. And most importantly is that this is the idea of the belief in one God. And this establishes the world's first monotheism. One of the sacred books is the Torah. There's also the Ten Commandments, and there's sacred laws that involve marriage. There's a sacred calendar, and there's also other religious ceremonies and holidays. They observe days such as the Sabbath on Saturday. They observe Yom Kippur, and they observe, in some instances, kosher laws. This is similar to the Muslim faith, where Muslims have to have food blessed or what is called halal. Family relationships also reflected evolving circumstances. Marriage and the family were fundamentally important in Jewish life. Celibacy was frowned upon, and almost all major Jewish thinkers and priests, who were all male, were married. As in other ancient cultures, marriage was a family matter, and it was too important to be left solely onto whims of young people. The bearing of children was seen in some ways as a religious function. Sons were especially desired because they maintained the family bloodline while keeping ancestral property in the family. A first newborn son became the head of the household upon his father's death. Mothers oversaw the early education of the children, but as boys grew older, their fathers provided them with more education. Later, formal schooling developed among Jewish boys who would also study the religious texts in schools, synagogues, and other places of study for prayer. When the Hebrews settled in Canaan, they faced spiritual, military, and political challenges. Not surprisingly, at times they worshipped the agricultural gods of their neighbors, despite warnings from the prophet that they were not to do this. The Bible reports that the greatest military danger to the Hebrews came from a group known as the Palestinians, who had established a kingdom in Canaan. Over the centuries, political and military developments led Jews to scatter widely around the world, first throughout the Mediterranean and then beyond. Jews maintained their cohesion as a group through intermarriage, shared rituals, and a devotion to a sacred text. They only rarely actively seek converts. Judaism thus became widespread geographically, but not very large in terms of numbers and parishioners when compared to other world religions. Today, the Jewish population of the world is estimated at about 15 million.